From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NOCO. I'm Erin O'Toole. A half-century ago this month, a small group of friends and activists from the gay and lesbian community gathered in Denver's Cheeseman Park to be together and celebrate their identity. It was the first iteration of what's now known as Denver PrideFest. The event evolved over the years through good times and bad. Now, Denver PrideFest's 50th edition is set for this Saturday and Sunday. There will be music, a parade, marching, food, basically a vibrant two-day gathering. To help us look back at 50 years of PrideFest, we reached out to Phil Nash. He's worked in journalism and politics and advocacy, and most recently, he's the author of the new history book, LGBTQ Denver. Phil, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You've lived in Denver since the late 1970s, so you've been to PrideFest a few times. What do you love most about PrideFest?
Well, I was part of the first parade that occurred at PrideFest in 1976. I may have missed a year or two, but I have been going just about every year. The thing that draws me back is seeing just the incredible diversity of the LGBTQ community. And, just wondering as I look at people who are there that I would never see anywhere else, just what is their story? Everybody's got a story, and people show up there that I would just not otherwise ever see. Yet we have some kind of connection. I love that.
So in your book, you write about the first iteration of Denver PrideFest. It was 1974 in Denver's Cheeseman Park, just a few dozen participants. Give us a sense of what that was like.
I wasn't there personally, but it was a celebration because the organization that sponsored it was the Gay Coalition of Denver, which had already had some successes in getting some laws overturned that oppressed LGBT people at Denver City Council. They had held a protest there in 1973 against 4 different laws, and they got them overturned by City Council. So there was real cause for celebration.
So, Phil, the gay and lesbian community in Denver had been protesting and asking for increased rights for a few years up to that point, had some successes. What kinds of issues were the focus in that moment?
Well, just a couple to start with. First of all, men going out in public in female attire was considered against the law, and drag queens were being arrested for just dressing as they did when they were performing. Another law was people of the same sex expressing affection for each other in public or even in a gay bar was against the law for same-sex couples, but it was not against the law for heterosexual couples. So it was discriminatory, and it was proven by the Gay Coalition to City Council that it was being used to discriminate against one class of Denver citizens.
There have been tough times for the LGBTQ community over the years. The AIDS epidemic in the 1980s comes to mind, as does Amendment 2, which in 1992 sought to remove protections against discrimination. How did those times affect or change PrideFest during that era?
Well, after about a decade of really seeing the community grow substantially, when AIDS came along in the early 1980s, it was going to be another 12, 13 years before there were effective treatments. It was a very, very dark time. And then, before we had gotten out of that crisis, the political crisis of Amendment 2 that would have essentially made all LGBTQ Coloradans second-class citizens came along in the early 90s. It was a very, very dark time. But what I would say about that is that it did not drive us back into the closet. It, in fact, increased our resiliency and our resolve to move forward and strengthen ourselves so that these indignities would not happen again.
And PrideFest continued to grow during that era?
PrideFest has grown as a result of 2 different things over the years. When something bad happens, people come out in droves. And then when something good happens, they also come out. So in the year right after Amendment 2 passed, You saw the parade route really swell by people who said, we need to come out and make a statement. Then, 3 years later, after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Amendment 2, they swelled even more because people were coming out to celebrate this great victory.
And it's so interesting that, PrideFest can be almost like a mirror of what's happening in society. The 21st century certainly has seen the legalization of civil unions and same-sex marriage. Colorado has elected and re-elected an openly gay man as governor. So how do you think these advances have affected PrideFest, and who attends PrideFest?
One of the things that I have come to be aware of, when you go to PrideFest, you don't just see LGBTQ people anymore. You see also straight people who are there because they are attracted to the celebratory vibe that permeates the festival. And many of them bring small children because they want to have their children exposed to a sense of people just really enjoying themselves, living their lives authentically as who they are. I also think that it's important to note that Pride brings in people from all over this region. People come down from Wyoming and come in from Kansas and Nebraska and from all over Colorado to take part in this really extraordinary event that feels so very empowering and where you realize that you are not alone.
What does Denver Pride Fest mean to you 50 years on?
What PrideFest means to me is the flourishing, not just of a community, but of a culture. Our movement doesn't have a Martin Luther King. We don't have a Gloria Steinem. We don't have a Cesar Chavez. We just have tens of thousands of people contributing what they can with what they know how to do by making donations and by sharing their talents. That comes out so extraordinarily well at Pride because you see all of that coming together in one place.
Before we go, Phil, I have to ask, the Colorado Republican Party has been in the headlines. They recently made a statement calling for pride flags to be burned. How do you think that will affect the mood at this year's Pride Fest?
I think just like any other hateful activity that we have seen over the years, it will just strengthen our resiliency and strengthen our resolve to come out more and more frequently and more powerfully. It's disgraceful, and it's not all Republicans who feel that way. And I'm just kind of hoping that organization will find a way to censure itself.
Phil Nash, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Phil Nash is author of the history book LGBTQ Denver. You'll hear more of Phil later this year in a new season of KUNC's podcast, The Colorado Dream. So be sure to follow that show on your favorite podcast app. That's it for us today on In the NOCO. Thanks so much for listening, and happy Pride.